Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover in this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. This podcast is very much a celebration of cinema. And this episode is one of my occasional special episodes too, where I bring in a filmmaker to talk about their body of work and their new upcoming movies. And I'm delighted to be joined in this episode of Film Stories by, the acclaimed British filmmaker, Stephen Frears, director of films as broad and wide as My Beautiful Laundrette, Dangerous Liaisons, Mary Riley, Philomena, The Queen, and the film that we're ostensibly here to talk about as well, The Lost King, which is arriving in UK cinemas on the 7th of October 2022. So this is quite a far-ranging conversation where we go through a fair amount of Stephen Frears' film work. So a few scene setters for you just before I play you the audio from our chat. So, amongst the films we talk about, 1985's My Beautiful Laundrette, which, and Stephen Frears mentions the name Hanif at one point during the conversation. That's the writer of My Beautiful Laundrette, Hanif Qureshi. We also talk about Dangerous Liaisons, and in that particular bit of the conversation, we talk about Milos Forman. And the context there is Milos Forman was making a film roughly around the same story called Valmont. In terms of Roddy Doyle, his name comes up. Just to set the scene there, Stephen Frears directed two films based on Roddy Doyle books. That would be The Snapper and The Van. Mary Riley, a fairly infamous Hollywood movie, as well as Hero or Accidental Hero, depending where you are in the world. Those were Frears' venture into big studio Hollywood filmmaking in the early 1990s. As you're about to hear, they didn't go particularly well. The Queen, I think, is fairly self-explanatory, but that comes up a few times during the chat. And then there's The Lost City, which is based on the story of the woman basically who led the hunt for the remains of King Richard, and ultimately then finding his remains in a car park in the Midlands. And the Midlands is where this podcast is from here in the UK, so it feels nice and resonant that. So, with all that set up, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play you a clip from the trailer for The Lost King, and then we're going to launch straight into my conversation with Stephen Frears. Interested to hear what you think of this one. I think it's quite a bouncy conversation. Here's the trailer, and then you'll hear the chat.
You're very competent and valued, Philippa, but I've decided you are at the right level for you.
Are you actually reading from an HR manual?
No.
What would improve things at work?
A penis.
You can have mine. Not very busy these days.
Mom, what are you doing?
You're coming to the theatre with me.
My kingdom for all!
I actually felt quite sorry for him. I'd quite like to visit his grave.
There isn't one. You sure you want to join this group? You look quite normal.
I'm not. Do you have any books on Richard III?
We have 8 titles.
I'll take them.
Which ones?
All of them. I know you're some sort of apparition. I've been trying to work out why you're here. I wonder if it's because you're lost. I know I can find him.
Who?
Richard.
Richard who?
Sorry, the third.
The King.
So that was a clip from The Lost King. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by its director for this podcast special, Mr. Stephen Frears. Mr. Frears, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you.
You're looking
very old, but very well, but very old.
If I can start on this one by just kind of paraphrasing something you've said in the past, that you've talked, no, don't worry, it's not one of those, but you've talked in the past about when you're choosing which projects to make, it's kind of like the more unconscious the decision, the better, is what you seem to have implied. I'm not sure to put words in your mouth. And so I wonder if I can just use that as a lead into the basics, really, because as the Lost King sits here on the eve of release, why this one? What was the unconscious, if you like, response to it? What was the hook in for you?
Well, I found it interesting.
Yeah.
The story of a woman, of course, is interesting. The history involved was interesting. The idea that the history was somehow needed to be reassessed was interesting. I didn't find anything about it uninteresting.
And it really was that instinctive to you once you've got it to that point.
I read it. In the end, it's what I'm offered.
Yeah.
I don't mean, if I say it was the best that I was offered, that sounds rather grudging. I was offered something that I enjoyed reading.
And so, because the inevitable thing, the inevitable assumption from us on the outside is that there'd been some kind of ongoing dialogue with Steve Coogan and Jeff Pope since you made Philomena together. I mean, is that the way you work when you have?
No, I might have said hello a few times. No, it isn't like that. None of you have a clue how it works.
Well, that's why I'm asking it as a question. It's just like from us on the outside, I find this quite fascinating.
No, I think I can't remember. I think they asked me to do Laurel and Hardy, and I said I wouldn't.
Yeah.
And then they asked me to do this, and I said I would. It's quite simple, and in a way, the less personal. What I mean is the friendship makes it worse, makes it harder rather than easier. So you try to make it as detached a decision as possible.
So before talking to you, I've gone through an awful lot of interviews that you've done before.
Oh my
God.
God.
There's something, well, no, it just goes to something you've just said there. It's just like, I've interviewed a lot of film directors I hugely admire and respect. And I ask about the process of getting a film going and what hooks in. I get some very, very complex answers, but a running theme, particularly in the interviews that you've done in the last 10, 15 years, almost seems to be to demystify that.
Yes.
To just kind of bring it down to actually, it's not as complex as it looks. It's a human being responding to something.
Most of my life is spent trying to demystify things. I mean, in other words, I don't like the mystification process. So I find it all increasingly nonsensical.
The reason I specifically home in on that is one of the reasons I do this podcast is I grew up in the West Midlands, and at a point where people,
the East.
Yes, you're Leicester, aren't you? Where people weren't making films around me, and it just looked like there were firewalls all around you. There was no way in. And whenever anyone did make a film in Britain, you'd read interviews, and it was as if it was the most difficult thing ever on planet Earth to do, and was putting people off. Are you conscious by being open about this that it just like leaves kind of a ladder to people, that it makes it a bit more reachable? Is that part of your intent?
Well, no, I don't think. I'm not that heroic. I don't remember firewalls. It just wasn't part of it. If you lived in the Midlands or probably in any provincial cities, it wasn't part of the experience. There weren't any film directors down our road. It's really as simple as that.
Yeah.
So I had no evidence of it. I became aware of the theatre, and I wanted to work in the theatre. And then when I was working in the theatre, I met a film director. So it was very, very simple in that sense. I mean, I'm sure it was more complicated in real life, but actually it was quite straightforward.
I remember when, I think it's in Steve Coogan's memoir, he talked about when they approached you to do Philomena in the first place. And he gave a hint almost as to your process there. Because he described, if I can quote his book at you a little bit, sorry about this. He did say, Stephen played hard to get. He made me chase him, but it was definitely worth it. And Steve says, I found my voice with him. We'd have robust conversations in which he would challenge me. He involved me the whole way, asking what a particular line meant in the script and pushing me to think about every nuance. And he said, the film is certainly better than the script. And Stephen lifted it. And that's, again, you're from the outside looking in again, you're slightly different, because if I go down your list of credits, your films don't have 7, 8 writers credited to them. No. They're one or two. I think High Fidelity had 4. I think that's the most I could find.
One of those was a dodgy bit, but yes, it had John Stephen DV.
So once you've said yes to a project and you get the script, is it important to you that you work with the writer at that point? Is there a period generally of a couple of months for you when you?
I come from the Royal Court Theatre, which was a writer's theatre, and I worked at the BBC in the 70s, I guess.
Yeah.
And when it was a writer's medium, And it was quite clear that the writing was what really mattered. And so I never got ideas above my station.
But when you're getting hold of, because you described yourself in the past as not a writer at all, and you've talked about how you love working with writers. But what is that process? What are you? Because Steve Coogan hints at it there, but sounds something like The Lost King, where you get a screenplay in front of you and you're interested in it. What's your footprint on that? What do you challenge the writers to do at that point? Is there a rewrite?
Write it better. I don't have a footprint. I just try to make it as good as possible. Is that not enough?
It's absolutely enough. But the reason I ask the question is you're not giving the usual answer. And that's what I find really interesting. That's what I
apologize for not being like everybody else. But yes, I mean, that's what I object to.
You object to the complication of the answer, if you like.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I completely get that. And I
can see this is driving you mad. The demand is simple. But, I think writers have very unique, the writers I've worked with are very good writers.
Yeah.
They have very, very unique perspectives on the world. And it doesn't seem to me my job to monkey around with them. That doesn't mean you shouldn't challenge them. So I'd never actually heard Steve's description of working with me, but it seems to me quite you just set out to make something better.
This isn't driving me mad at all. I think, again, what you're doing is you're making it reachable to people, whether you're intending to do that or not.
Yes.
And
No. I mean, I hadn't thought of it as being reachable for people, but yes, it's quite a straightforward business. There are parts of it that are unstraightforward.
I might ask you about one or two of those in a minute.
A lot of it is very straightforward.
But certainly something that comes through in this film particularly, and I watched it last week and enjoyed it thoroughly, is kind of just the little details. And again, I'm just curious if this is something from the script, if this is something that you've honed in on.
Give me an example.
Well, there's one of the things that really got me is there's the way you're portraying Philippa Langley, played by Sally Hawkins in the film, her chronic illness. And there's a tiny line in there, and it's the smallest, it might be the smallest line in the entire film, but it kind of knocked me sideways, really. And it's a moment where her ex-husband just says, I'm going to take the boys to town to get a bite to eat. And she just says under her breath, just looking away slightly from the camera, because you can. And I just...
What does she say?
Because you can. And it's a small moment in the life of chronic illness. And appreciating that line could be read a couple of different ways. But that's the life of someone with chronic pain.
Yes.
It's just like that the option is taken away from them.
Or you could say it's the life of a woman with children.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what the husband, the man, I mean, I don't mean that men are dreadful or anything like that, but that's what, they don't have the choice, and I suppose men do.
But when you're, I'm just curious how you see a moment like that, because there's a couple of interpretations just of that scene. I'm not very academic in the slightest. It's just someone that completely caught me off guard of what you're looking for in those tiny moments.
Well, I'm not really looking for anything, but if that's what the line says, it makes sense.
This is one of my favourite interviews in ages.
Why? I think I'm very straightforward, but I know nobody ever believes what I say.
Well, I'm quite the contrary. I'm believing what you're saying, and the straightforwardness is utterly refreshing. But the fact that I'm responding a little bit like that is just because it is so rare. There is one thing. I mean, a little bit. I saw a little bit of controversy have bubbled up over the film, which I don't particularly want to get into the nuances of that. But I am curious that something you said of certainly with some of the TV work that you've been doing, that you said if there's a big difference between making films now and when you started, it's just lawyers are more omnipresent, that there are legal checks.
Well, the films I've been making.
Yeah, not least because, you've been making films about real people and real events. And yes. I'm always conscious of, there was an example, I think it was where Scorsese was making Goodfellas and Casino, that because Goodfellas had already been published in book form, the legal checks could be lesser. But because of almost the rushed chronology of getting Casino to the screen, the book came out afterwards. And so the legal checks were incumbent on the film itself. And I'm just wondering...
Well, I can tell you a story about that. There was a period when I kept saying, we should be making The Queen for television.
Yeah.
And one of the arguments that I was convinced by to make it for the cinema was that under the television, there is legislation, isn't there?
Yeah.
You have a responsibility to be impartial or something like that. At the same time, if, as it were, the television could come and say, look, we bought in this film, somebody else made it and we just bought it in, they were somehow absolved from that responsibility. So in as much as it might have been inaccurate, it placed less of a burden on the companies making it, on the television companies, whereas television is actually legislated for. And if you say something that is untrue or perhaps unsupported, it must be harder.
And is that specific to British television, or is that...
that was the argument that was used to me by a producer. And I thought, oh, I see. So this whole film, which is sort of guesswork, and I don't know what happened, I could see that it made life simpler.
And in the case of, in the case of The Lost King, were things being thrown up that affected the story that you wanted to tell? Or is it just
you just say, is this what happened? Is this true? Can you support this? And that's that's what the lawyers say. Can you support this? If you're saying they did this, is it supported?
Yeah.
And I'm yet to hear anything that was unsupported. In other words, I think, but it's only that what the script was saying and what the film says and what Philippa says is right.
Yeah.
Nobody is, they say, for example, the university will say, well, we paid for the dig. Well, they didn't. What happened was that Philippa paid for the first 2 weeks out of crowdfunding. And then in the course of which they found Richard III, then Leicester University said, oh, we'll give you an extra week. So of course Leicester could say we contributed towards it, but not we paid for it.
I understand.
I find that quite convincing.
And so
even one of the people in the archaeology club said to Leicester University, look, I wouldn't go down that route, as though he knew it was shaky.
So again, this is my naive question from the outside looking in. When you're bringing institutions to the screen in the way that you do, and again, I'm not going specifics on that, what level of permissions do you need to be able to do?
I don't know. Ask a lawyer. I have no idea. I just say, well, but basically you make jokes. Will I go to prison for this? Will I be sued? Will I be this? When I made the Queen, will I go to the Tower? You make those jokes. But of course, underneath it all, are you saying, is this legal? Is this legal?
Yeah.
I don't want to make lies. Why would I want to make lies? Why would anybody want to make lies? So is this supported?
Can I ask about the casting of Sally Hawkins?
Yes.
Because I think her performance in this is extraordinary, and I think it's a character we just very, very rarely see on screen. And so I assume it was fairly clear from the start that Steve Coogan would play a part in this. But how early into the conversation did Sally Hawkins come?
I can't date it, but I remember being asked to meet Sally, and it was clear that, I say a lot of this in retrospect. I don't think I thought as clearly at the time. I thought, she's a woman who appears very, very vulnerable and is very vulnerable, but is also very strong. Well, since you were making a film about somebody who went from vulnerability to strength, it's pretty obvious that was what you were looking for. Or it now seems obvious that was what we were looking for.
I always get a sense in the interviews that you do as well that working with actors is one of the highs of the job.
Well, I have great admiration for them. Yeah, I think they're terrific, brilliant.
And a lot of this ethos that you're talking about, does that go right back to the start? Say when you were making My Beautiful Laundrette, when you knew presumably less about making feature films in the way that we know them now. Mm. Would you say that you're pretty much the same filmmaker as you were there, just with a bedrock of experience on top?
Well, I was Dan Day-Lewis.
He's not done too badly.
No, absolutely. My Beautiful Laundrette was such a carefree experience. Yeah. And it was, I knew the script was very, very good, but it wasn't important in any. In retrospect, it seems to have been an important moment.
Yeah.
But we were, that's what Mick Jagger says about the Rolling Stones. We were just larking about.
Yeah.
And it was, it was good fun. And the jokes were part of it. So there wasn't the sort of weight of responsibility that it's always good when you don't have that burdening you.
They showed us that film. It must have been only 5 years or so after it came out at my school.
Progressive school you were at.
Well, that's exactly. I didn't appreciate that at the time at all. But yeah, they were a long way ahead of where I thought. Yeah. And it was a boys' school as well. that's usually quite restrictive and quite repressive.
Were there a lot of Asian kids there?
Not massively, but
Yeah.
it was. I think it's still about 80. I think it's about 80% white. But it was. I remember we had a film studies teacher, and we were just doing film studies only for because film studies wasn't really a thing then. They brought us in for 8 weeks just towards the end of the summer term, and he sat and showed us He sat and showed us 3 films. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Play It Again, Sam, and My Beautiful Laundrette.
Man of good taste.
Well, it's incredible triple bill, isn't it?
Yes,
but
very, very
I watched a few Q&As that you've done where people are talking to you about films you've made 5, 10, 20 years ago, and you almost seem surprised at the fact that they're still talked about, that they still have that level of impact. And
it is quite, I promise you, it is quite startling that films I made over 30 years ago matter so much. You must understand that I grew up at a time when there wasn't this sort of library of films. I saw a film and then that was the end of it. And, clearly some were better than others, but the idea that there was a film history, all that came later in my life. So, yes, of course, it's a surprise that films still have a life 35 years after you made them.
In the case of My Beautiful Laundrette, I think clearly by the nature of the teacher I was working with, the impact of that was being felt fairly quickly.
No, it took us all by surprise, but it was, the impact was huge.
But how have you, I don't know, I'm loath to use the word footprint with you again because it didn't go too well last time, but in terms of the legacy of a film, such as that, for instance, I mean, where the importance of it, I think I can say it's just gone beyond the cinema screen as well.
Yeah.
It's just the human being in the midst of it that's interesting to me, that you say you made this film in a carefree way, almost as if you didn't know,
Well, to a certain extent, I didn't know. I mean, I had to have everything explained to me. I remember Hanif, when eventually Hanif turned up, and and he said, "Well, look, these people, we came over from Karachi or wherever it was," and I said, "Well, should we be making a film about ships arriving and like The Godfather 2, you actually see the process of immigration?" And then we decided in the end we shouldn't make that. But it wasn't. I knew it was important. I knew that nobody had said it before.
Yeah.
That it was being made, nobody knew there was a Pakistani middle class.
Yeah.
So I knew that it was original and important, but I also didn't think it was important because why would a scruffy little film you're making for Channel 4 be important?
Yeah.
It's inconceivable. So it was made with a sort of innocence. And of course, innocence is a profound quality.
And do you try to hold on to that when you're making films?
Well, that's what Orson Welles says.
Yeah.
Look at
I was badly paraphrasing, but I was heading there.
No, that's exactly what Wells says. You have to try and retain your innocence.
And how do you find that? Is that something you're good at? Is that a skill?
As usual, I don't think about it. I mean, you can see where you're being cynical, or you try not to be cynical, I suppose.
Yeah. One of the, I remember reading the book, the memoir, I think it was, of Nicholas Heitner, of his time at the National Theatre, and then when he moved into film. It's the reason one of the reasons I asked the question, really. And there's something that's always struck in that when he came to make The Manners of King George for cinema, he said he made his best film at a point where he knew the least about it.
Yes, no, you can see that in the film.
Yeah, and I think it's Anthony Minghella as well. I think there's a Faber book on him, Minghella on Minghella. He talks about going onto the set of Truly Madly Deeply, walking into the middle of everyone on the first day and say, I'm badly paraphrasing, I've got absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Please help me.
I've never said that, but I've certainly felt it.
But I mean, you've been open about rejecting, for instance, auteur theory, and that it's not for
more
you.
And more. It seems to me catastrophic. The only people who believe in the auteur theory are film critics. And look what a mess it's got them in. So it's easier not to think about it. I mean, there were people who were very, very clever. I mean, included Godard and some of those French people. And there are people in America, Wilder was an auteur and he was brilliant. He was a brilliant writer and director. But most people aren't like that, and I'm certainly not like that. So the idea, and although the auteur theory did apply to Hitchcock or Minnelli or people who didn't write their own films, it's sort of more and more nonsense. I mean, it's also because the cinema became self-regarding. And I grew up at a time when it wasn't self-regarding and wasn't important.
It always seems to undersell collaboration to me as well.
Yes, well, it's entirely collaborative.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see that Stanley Kubrick didn't collaborate, or maybe he did collaborate for all I know, but I can see that he didn't talk about his collaborators.
So if I can just come back to The Lost King, when you are putting a story like this out and you say that, the story's got to work for you, are you conscious that when you put a film out that's a piece of history, whether you intend it to or not, it will be seen to some degree as a document of record? Do you ever feel that weight on you?
I remember them saying to me at Venice, when the Queen surfaced, the film The Queen surfaced, and the journalist next day saying, well, this will be the official version. I said, well, no, that's nonsense. And then I remember once watching a documentary about what happened the week of Diana's death and thinking, oh, well, we got most of it right.
Yeah.
I clearly don't think, and I certainly don't see how it applies to The Lost King when record of what?
The film is very good at putting a story of history down and people just believing it and not necessarily challenging it. I guess that's kind of what I was going for then.
Well, The Lost King is about challenge, isn't it? It's about
Absolutely.
challenging the official version.
Well, that's you said that right at the start, and that was the other part of it that really got me. That I really loved. I really loved the character. I think Sally Hawkins' character.
She's brilliant. Sally is brilliant.
But also the fact that we do tend to be spoon-fed an awful lot of stories with very little pushback.
If you were my age, if you were me, I was educated. I used to be able to recite kings and queens of England, their dates. Yeah. And I was taught imperial history. And the main experience of the last 20, 30 years is of how badly taught I was and how there was another. If you read Willie Dalrymple's book about the Indian Empire, you realize you were just led up the garden path by your teachers and by the institutions that existed in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
You were just told nonsense. All this stuff about statues being pulled down, about Cecil Rhodes, there is a parallel story going, and you somehow have to deal with both things. I'm sure Rhodes did a lot of good, but I'm sure he did made a lot of money on the side. The world is very complicated. And at a certain point, I guess I refused to have the complications denied. But when I was a child, they were denied. There were no complications. And when I made Laundrette, I said to Hanif, look, I am white, I am to all extents a white imperialist. Yeah. I don't pretend to be more than that, or indeed more Marxist, or, I had to have everything taught to me. And so I really learned about colonialism and about people from India and Pakistan from Hanif, in all truth. And then I can remember a woman coming into whom we cast in the film and explaining, well, we're all a cocktail of all these nationalities. So I've learned, as it were, on the job.
One of the things you also do quite a lot in your interviews is you name check collaborators that you share the credit around.
Oh, you mean I shouldn't acknowledge their existence?
No, well, I point it out because not everybody does that. Well, and again, this goes to.
Are you blaming me for this? Am I doing right or am I doing wrong?
I'm praising you for this, and I'm going to ask you about one particular person and the impact that they've had on your career. Because I'm when I talk to people about trying to break into film, and I'm on the outside of it, yeah. I urge people to read 300 names in the end credits, and just like that's 300 jobs that if we're looking for us on the outside to find a way in. That those are all people who are working on a film, and yes. It's doable. But you mentioned briefly in an interview a while back Christine Langham and the impact that she's had. I just wonder if you can just talk to her a little bit.
I was asked to make a film called The Deal and I was taken to a meeting, and Jim Naughtie, the broadcaster, who had written the book that Peter based it on, he said, this is what's been going on in Britain in the last 10 years. And he talked about Blair and Brown coming together and forming this group of these two young men with Mandelson I suppose, in the 80s and revitalising the Labour Party. And it ended with Blair becoming leader of the Labour Party and Brown not becoming leader of the Labour Party. And they were all around the table. ITV said, this is the thing we most want to do, the week before they pulled out. And in the end, I said, who is going to produce this? And this little voice said, I am. And it was Christine. I mean, it was quite a comic moment, this woman saying, well, amongst all these big men, here is this little woman and I'm going to produce it. And I became friends with Christine. And I've done, I think she said 5 the other day, but it might be more than that. In other words, I really value her.
And she's been a phenomenal force in the British film industry as well,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The alternative version, I mean, I made Tim Bevan a producer, so I have a good record. or, you can say, well, you know how to pick them before they get there. So, but yes, I did that.
When again, the candidness of your interviews, going back to something like Dangerous Liaisons, and we get sent from our side of the fence like press kits that tell us everybody was the first choice for this and they were ideal and everything was perfect and wonderfully varnished. I've just been listening to a terrific interview with you when you came to do Dangerous Liaisons, when you were in no doubt whatsoever that you weren't the first choice for the job, that you knew about that Christopher Hampton had written this screenplay beforehand, but you were very far down the line, and when you got it, you just snapped it up.
Well, it was so good.
Well,
won a bloody Oscar.
Is that an unusual tale for you, that you find a script that you like and you're almost taking your place in the queue, or is that where you were at that point in your career? Because you've talked about scripts coming to you, and
yes, they've always come to me. No, not anymore. I think I'm first choice. Maybe I'm not.
Well, I was going to say that must have changed quite dramatically.
They used to send. They would put the name on the top of the script, and then they cross it out and put your name underneath. Christopher Hampton will say, "I said all along it should be Stephen." The man who turned it down before me was. Well, Louis Malle said, but I live in the same road as Milos Forman, who was making his version of it at the same time. Volker Schlendorf, who's a wonderful man.
Yeah.
And he was the man who turned it down before me. And Christopher said, now can we go to Stephen? And I just read it and said, this is fantastic. I mean, it was easy. Volker, when he saw the film, he said, oh, I thought it was about the servants, but you've just left them out. So, yes, but it was that. I dread to think how many people were offered it before me. And to me, it was perfectly obvious.
How many names were on the script crossed out by the time it made it to you?
I never asked, but I dread to think. It was really the presence of Milos Forman, who was a great filmmaker. And he frightened people off. I mean, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a magnificent film. And then he just made Mozart. So people were right to be frightened of him.
So he was making Valmont at the same time, wasn't he? That was the competition.
6 months later.
Yeah.
But I knew that, I didn't have, I was nobody. I was a bloke who made these scruffy little films for Channel 4. I had nothing to lose.
And again, I mean, going to a film of this scale and you having nothing to lose. The other side of it that I didn't appreciate with Dangerous Liaisons is just how quickly, once you got going, you made it. Because if I got this right,
we started shooting on June the 1st, and it was in the cinemas by Christmas Day.
And so, what was your deadline to finish that? Because that was distributing in film cans and stuff, presumably.
We were still showing it before we'd finished it. I remember there was a screening in Los Angeles, and I said to Glenn, "Well, I have to go back and finish the last reel." Glenn Close. And she said, you mean it's not ready yet? I said, no, we have to go back and finish it. And indeed, that is what happened. But I did say, I may not be as good as Milos, but I'm certainly quicker than him.
It didn't work out too badly, did it?
It was a wonderful script. And once the cast settled down, they were dazzling.
I love that film. Always love that film. And that I mean, you talked, again, I keep quoting your stuff back at you, but you said you never took permanent residence in Hollywood. You've always been based in the UK, but that was the period where you did do a couple of Hollywood films.
Well, I got curious enough, I got involved with Scorsese and I made The Grifters for him.
Yeah.
And then the real difference is between independent films and studio films. And making The Grifters, which Scorsese produced, was like making a British film. It was, the emphasis was on the material.
Yeah.
And it was good material and very interesting. And then I made a studio film, and that's where I got into a mess.
Is it true that Scorsese rang you at home?
Yes.
To offer you the incredible?
No, I think he rang my agent first, and she said, "Oh, Martin Scorsese." And anyway, I'd be waiting all my life for him to ring me because I
And so the one disappointment.
George Clooney rang me at home. I remember.
Did he? What does George Clooney talk to you about at home?
He wanted me to do Failsafe, which I did.
Excellent. That's not a bad phone call, is it?
No.
So you've also talked candidly about the one that didn't work for you, Mary Riley.
Yeah.
And I was reading an old Premiere magazine article about that being stuck in post-production for 18 months.
Well, that's because we didn't finish shooting it when we were supposed to.
Yeah.
And Julia Roberts went off to make another film, which she was under contract to do. So that's what happened.
But
and you have to reassemble everybody.
Was that the one point you were in the crosshairs of the Hollywood press, really? Because even the tone of the article I was reading earlier just feels very snide and punch downy.
Yeah, well, one day you make a film and it goes wrong, and it's a nightmare.
Yeah,
and that was, there've been other low moments in my life, but that was a particularly vivid one. And you can't somehow get. Oh, and then I made the film with Dustin. You get into a mess.
Yeah,
I had the grace to realize that I was standing in the wrong place,
and
I couldn't do what I thought I could. I thought I'd be good at what the studios wanted, and the truth is, I hadn't a clue how to do it.
And that was the point where you took the same crew and then made The Snapper. The same crew.
No, the same cameraman.
The same camera, right? Okay. But the Roddy Doyle films that you did, was that almost like a refresh for your head? Was that a rebuilding some self-confidence?
The script of The Snapper was fantastic.
Oh, it's great. Love that.
I can't believe, you couldn't believe what you were reading. It was just wonderful. And I remember saying, look, it seems to me I know we've just come back from Hollywood, but it seems to me we should play by their rules.
And so we're almost out of time, sadly. But I mean, two things really. I mean, you've talked in the past about resisting the bigger films, but the rumor machine says that you came very close to a James Bond spin-off movie.
There was an idea. It didn't get very far.
But was that of interest? Was that as close as you've come to something that big since?
Well, they wanted me to make a film with.
It was Halle Berry, wasn't it?
Halle Berry.
Yeah.
And they flew me, and she was wonderful. I could, there's this beautiful woman sitting opposite you, who I like very, very much. Why would you say? And I didn't. Because it never led anywhere. It never led into trouble. So it was just a sort of wonderful fantasy. But how can you not have that fantasy if you're sitting opposite this beautiful woman in Los Angeles? But didn't get anywhere.
Stephen Frears, sadly, we're out of time. Huge congratulations on The Lost King. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. This has been a delight.
Anytime.
And that was my conversation with Stephen Frears for, primarily The Lost King, but as you can hear, we talked about all sorts of things. But just to reiterate, The Lost King, at the time this podcast is released, is playing in UK cinemas. And that brings me to the end of this special episode of Film Stories. If I've not completely bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. Our website is filmstories.co.uk, and our online shop where you can buy all of our magazines and our sneakers Blu-ray is store.filmstories.co.uk. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/filmstories. I think that's it, really. Nothing else to plug. If you do like this podcast, please do subscribe to it. Please do like it. Please do all those things, really, that help small independent podcasts bubble up. In the meantime, I'm off to start writing the next episode. So, main thing, as always, you all look after yourselves. You all take care. I'll be back soon with your regular episode of Film Stories. Bye-bye.